In Chapter 19, we have a major switch in our topics. We are going from molecular biology to evolution in one abrupt leap. In this section, we move from looking at a phenotype and how that phenotype is expressed in an individual to how that phenotype allows them to survive in an environment. So the concept of evolution is that a population or a species will change over time because some individuals have traits that are more advantageous in their environment than the other. So we're going to look at how this theory of evolution came about, and then in chapter 21 we're going to talk about we're going to sort of link genotypes with evolution and see how evolution actually affects the alleles and the frequency of alleles in the population. I know that sometimes evolution is a hard subject for some people. I don't mean difficult material, but I mean, can't think of how I'm trying to say it. It just can be sort of a touchy subject, and I completely understand that. If you happen to fall into that category, I just ask that you learn the topic with an open mind. Come talk to me if you have any questions, and feel free to brain dump it if you don't agree with it when we're all finished. But I do ask that you learn the material for the exam. Because it is a requirement in our course. But if you do fall into that category and you feel like you need to speak with me about it, please feel free to come and chat. I'm more than happy to chat with you. So there are two major definitions for evolution. The first is Charles Darwin's definition. So Charles Darwin is sort of considered the grandfather of evolution and biology. And the reason is that before Charles Darwin, people just sort of thought that things were as they were since they were created and hadn't really changed over time. But Charles Darwin started to look at some evidence around him and see that organisms actually were very specifically adapted to their environment. And he also noticed that they were often similar to those around them and similar to ancestral species. So Charles Darwin's definition is actually something called descent with modification. And this is the idea that living species are descendants of ancestral species, but that they're different from them because those species have changed over time to fit their unique environments. Our present day definition is actually linked to genetics. Our present definition is that evolution is a change in the genetic composition of a population, and that genetic composition can change over time depending on what traits are advantageous in a particular environment. Now, chapter 19 covers descent with modification, talks about Charles Darwin, it talks about the mechanism of evolution, and then chapter 21 will switch over into the genetics and talking about alleles and frequencies of alleles within a population. So we'll come back to this present day definition. So if you remember way back to chapter 1, we talked about some of the unifying themes in biology. We talked about organization and different levels of organization. As things become more complicated, they take on new structures and new functions. We talked about chemistry being the basis of life. We talked about organisms interacting with one another and transferring energy and matter throughout an ecosystem. And then our last unifying theory was evolution. And we didn't really talk about evolution very much. And the reason for that is that we come back and do a whole unit on it. But evolution is really important, and it's really central to biology because evolution explains the vast diversity that is present in living organisms on our planet, and it allows us to connect different traits, different characteristics, because organisms are derived from a common ancestor that have adapted to fit their unique environments. Evolution is also a process that explains all of the unity on Earth. So we look around us and we see all kinds of diversity. If you just walk out your front door, you see different types of plants, different, trees, shrubs, grasses, just within your field of view. You even probably see a diversity of animals. You see diversity in people. And the reason that all of these organisms share similar characteristics goes back to that idea of the common ancestor. And that's really the focus of Darwin's descent with modification, that all organisms are ultimately related, and those that are more closely related share similar features, but they are diverse in that they are each uniquely fit for their environment. So evolution is a theory. If you recall, also from chapter 1, we talked about a theory versus a hypothesis. So a hypothesis was a short statement that answers a very specific question. They are testable. You can support or not support your hypothesis. A theory is like a really big hypothesis. It covers a wide range of observations, but unlike a hypothesis, it can answer a lot of questions. So a hypothesis is specific in that it answers one question, but a theory can explain a lot of observations and a lot of hypotheses. Theories are generally accepted as quote unquote true. A lot of people will think of theories as a sort of a law that cannot be disproved, but actually a theory, although different from a hypothesis, is similar in that it can be disproven, or new evidence might come up that would suggest the theory needs to be modified. But generally, a theory is sort of accepted as a sort of a universal explanation because it is continually supported by new observations. As new observations are tested and new hypotheses are tested, the theory continues to be supported. So evolution is a theory in biology because it has been supported starting with Darwin and even before Darwin, really, but Darwin was the first one to really put it on paper. And then sort of continually since Darwin, we've been able to support this idea of evolution. So I mentioned earlier that before Charles Darwin, the prevailing idea about the diversity on Earth was that all organisms were created by God and had been unchanged since creation. So this is sort of a Western idea, a first world Western idea that organisms were created and they were the same as they always were, and there was no reason for them to change because they were created perfectly. Associated with this was the idea that the Earth was young. So there was not a lot of dating techniques till much more recently, and so people couldn't actually really measure the age of the Earth. But going along with this idea that organisms were created by God, that led them to also hypothesize sort of a biblically based date for the creation of Earth, which would put the Earth at only a few thousand years old. And now, of course, this is where this idea of creation and evolution can get a bit sticky for some people. So as I said, absolutely come talk with me if you have any questions. I am certainly not going to try to force evolution upon you, except for understanding the concept. And I am also not disregarding the idea of creation and evolution. I just want to set the stage for what the sentiment was sort of at the time of Charles Darwin and why Charles Darwin's idea was so revolutionary. I also will come back to this when we talk to Darwin, but Darwin didn't set out to sort of disprove any theory of creation or anything. That was not his intent. His intent was simply to explain the diversity of living organisms on Earth. All right, so let's talk about some of the other, some of the people that were thinking about diversity before Charles Darwin. One of them was Carolus Linnaeus. He lived in the early 1700s. And he's really important to the study of biology because he gave us a classification system for naming all of this huge diversity of living organisms. So he classified animals and plants based on how similar they were to other organisms. So this was looking at their physical characteristics, their environments, things like that. And from him, we get this Latin binomial format for naming species. So even today, all species have two names. They are named based on their genus, which is one category above species, and then their species. So for humans, we're Homo sapiens. Our genus then would be Homo. Our species would be sapien. And all living things are named that way still today. So Carolus Linnaeus attributed these similarities to creation. So he wasn't really trying to explain or give a reason for their diversity or why they were similar. He was saying that they were created this way, but I'm going to categorize them for you. So this diagram on the right shows sort of our big domains. We talked about those in chapter 1. We have our two prokaryotic domains, our bacteria and archaea. Those are our single-celled organisms. And there's all kinds of different families and classes and things of those prokaryotes. We are definitely not going to get into them in this class. We're going to talk about eukaryotes. But even for this class, we're actually not going to talk about all of these different groups. You do that in Biology 102. But just sort of in a general sense, we've got our eukaryotic domain. So those are our multicellular organisms, our eukaryotic cells with the organelles and the nucleus and all of that. Within that domain, we have plants, animals, and fungi. This diagram shows the animal kingdom. And then we have an increasingly more specific category system. So we go kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, each one getting more and more specific. So if we follow this all the way down, we end up with the chordate phylum, which is a sort of a precursor to a spinal cord running down the back. Then we've got the mammals, so a specific group of animals. The carnivores, so those that are meat eaters. We have the felines, or the cats, the big, all of the cats, big cats, small cats, etc. Then we've got the panther genus, and then this panther at the top, Panthera pardus. So we see that it is genus Panthera, so in a group with other panthers, but one specific species within the panther genus. So Charles Darwin drew from a wide variety of places in order to support his theory of evolution. So he looked at individuals like Linnaeus and a couple others that Lamarck and Charles Lyell and James Hutton. These are some people that were contemporaries, some people that came before him, and he looked at their theories, and he also looked at the fossil record, geology, and sort of put together his own theory of why organisms appear to be the way that they are. He's quite famous for studying Galapagos finches. I'll talk about those in just a few minutes, but there's a picture here just showing the diversity of some of these birds that live on the different Galapagos islands. All right, so one thing that Charles Darwin looked at and considered when he was formulating this theory of evolution was the idea of fossils. So fossils are the remains of organisms from the past that have been encased in rock and soil in the ground, and they've been preserved. So over time, those bones turn into, they basically calcify and turn into rock themselves. The rock sort of fills in the bones and things and turns them into, basically they're replaced by stone. So when fossils form, an animal dies, their remains are they lay where the animal died in the ground, and then some sort of rock, or sediment or soil will wash over. Maybe the wind blows it over, maybe water covers it, and a layer of silt lays down. And over time, you get these different layers of rock and soil on top of this organism. And they're often very distinct layers, so you can see in what layer each of these organisms was. These layers are called strata, and they become layers of rock. So fossils are most likely going to be found in a rock layer. And then the older fossils are going to be farther down toward the bottom. So we can see that valley there, or canyon with the water in it there on the bottom. We've got the different levels of rock. Those ones that are lower are going to be older. Those ones that are higher levels are going to be younger. And so one thing that Charles Darwin noticed when he was looking at fossils and he was looking at exposed remains of past organisms in different areas that he was in was that organisms from the past looked much different than organisms that were more recent in the fossil record. But also that organisms living today had similar characteristics to those fossils, particularly those younger fossils. I guess I kind of skipped ahead. This is a picture of a dinosaur fossil here. So in studying and using fossils of plants and animals, Darwin was able to sort of show that this idea of descent with modification, that dead organisms, like whole species that had died, look different to more modern ones, but they were also similar. He could see similar characteristics in organisms that lived in similar locations or were similar types of organisms over different locations. And so he noticed that there was some sort of change taking place, that at some point these organisms were alive, but now they were not. And so he hypothesized that the reason that they were no longer alive is that for some reason those species were no longer adapted to their environment. There was some sort of change that made them less able to survive, whereas other ones were able to survive and pass on their traits. So Charles Darwin was really not the first person to sort of give a hypothesis for the mechanism of evolution. Many people were thinking about it. Charles Darwin is sort of the most famous because his idea has been the most widely supported. But there was a Frenchman named Lamarck who also proposed a hypothesis for evolution. And he was about 50, 60 years before Charles Darwin. But his hypothesis for evolution was the idea of use and disuse. So his hypothesis was that an organism could acquire a characteristic over its lifetime, and that lifetime would be passed on to the next generation. So this would be analogous to, say, a baby giraffe being born with a short neck like a horse, and it stretching over its lifetime so that now when it has a baby, its neck has stretched as well. Sort of a different example would be if you have a bodybuilder who builds up his muscles really huge, and then he has a baby, and now his baby is born with those really huge muscles. So Lamarck's idea was that you could acquire a characteristic that was advantageous within your own lifetime and pass it on. Evidence suggests that that is not how evolution works. Evolution actually requires that there is already an advantageous trait in the population, or there is already a trait in the population, and then if it is advantageous, it is passed on. So this is important for two reasons. One, he recognized that organisms were well suited to their environments, and that was important because no one had really recognized this before Lamarck. And so he recognized that organisms had very specific traits that made them fit for their environment. Unfortunately, he was thinking about acquired characteristics, and traits that you acquire over a lifetime are not passed on to the next generation. And the reason is that traits that are going to be passed on have to have a genetic basis. They have to be coded in the DNA somehow. Darwin also took into consideration the idea of artificial selection. So humans have been doing sort of a controlled selection process for a really long time. We've been domesticating animals, we've been sort of selecting crops, corn and wheat and things for good characteristics that we like, that are high in protein or high in sugar or do well in a particular environment, even without actually doing any genetic engineering. Humans have been performing this sort of selection over time. So his idea was that, hey, humans have been selecting agricultural traits and pet traits for a really long time and breeding organisms specifically for those traits. And so he proposed that actually this was the way that natural selection worked as well, but it wasn't humans directing the traits. So we have an example here of sort of an artificial selection situation. All of these vegetables, you probably recognize almost all of them, are related to the wild mustard plant. So that wild mustard is there in the middle. And we get a variety of different vegetables based on selecting them for specific characteristics. So you get kale when you select for leaf size in mustard. You get Brussels sprouts when you select for axillary buds. You get broccoli when you select for flowers and stems. And so this is just one example of how humans can actually select for the traits that they want in an organism. So Darwin thought, hey, if humans can do this, it must be the same principle. If an environment is putting pressure on a particular trait, maybe the environment can cause that change as well. Also, a little bit before Charles Darwin was a man named James Robert Malthus. James Robert Malthus was actually an economist, not a biologist or an evolutionist, but he proposed that human suffering often resulted from a competition of resources, so that the human population was growing so fast and it was increasing faster than its resources, and that this was causing a lot of the strife and pain and heartache for human populations, that there were simply not enough resources to go around. So Darwin took this idea and applied it to other organisms as well. And he noticed that all organisms produce more offspring than their environment can maintain. Some of the offspring are not going to survive. Some organisms in the population are not going to be able to survive because they don't have the advantageous traits that others in the population have. So there were a lot of parts to Darwin's theory. There was the idea of the environment. There was the idea of traits that specifically fit the environment. There was the idea that not all organisms survive at the same rate. And so he had started to form this hypothesis for natural selection. But one of the problems was this idea of the age of the Earth, and the idea that the Earth was young. So Darwin was proposing that all of this process of natural selection had to take a really long time, that it was actually probably a really slow process, that a population didn't just snap its fingers and become adapted immediately, that it would possibly take several generations, and that required time. Before Darwin, a man named James Hutton was a geologist, and he proposed that Earth's geological features could be explained by gradual mechanisms. That things like the formation of the Grand Canyon, the formation of mountains, the formations of riverbeds, things like that, sometimes could happen quickly, but overall, those formations were actually formed gradually, and that they might take hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. So the Grand Canyon is a great example. That wasn't sort of carved out in a single day. It would have been formed by millions of years of the Colorado River running through this region. So that was the man on the left, Charles Lyell on the right with that fantastic facial hair. He proposed that those processes that James Hutton was talking about were actually the same processes forever as they were today. So they would have required a very long time span in order to occur. And so that helped Darwin to sort of propose that, hey, if the Earth is as old as these geologists are suggesting, then natural selection has time to happen. I got ahead of myself again. So this is just a slide that says what I just said. If geological changes were slow, then the Earth must be older than a few thousand years. That the Earth had to be old enough to allow time for those slow geological processes. And it had to be old enough to allow for these very slow and subtle changes that occur to produce the huge amount of diversity on Earth.